Hi everyone, welcome to Chaos Knowledge, where headlines meet depth and noise gives way to nuance. I am Afeera Firdous. To discuss the Trump administration's role in mediating India-Pakistan recent conflict, we have invited Michael Kugelman to our podcast today. Michael is a Washington-based South Asia expert and writer of the South Asia Brief column for Foreign Policy magazine. Thank you, Michael, for joining us here.
Thank you. Great to be here.
Recent crisis was just not a clash, but it was a Rubicon moment for this region. If India's recent strikes on Pakistani mainland were meant to send a message, did it land? As a South Asia expert, do you think, what do you think were the India's actual objectives during the conflict? And did India achieve them?
I mean, one cannot overstate just how serious this most recent clash was. I would argue that it's the closest that India and Pakistan have come to going to war since they both became formal nuclear states. I would argue that we could talk about the Kargil clash in 1999, but had both countries, India and Pakistan, using forced missiles, drones deep into the other side's territory. It was not a geographically limited clash as you had with Kargil. So it was very, very troubling for sure. Now, in terms of did India achieve its objectives, India's stated objectives were to degrade the threat of terrorism from Pakistan, given the issue of this notion of Pakistan-sponsored terrorism. But I would argue that it's too early to be able to evaluate whether objectives have been achieved. It is true that in those initial strikes from India, it targeted multiple spots, and those included spots to have had a presence of terrorist actors that threaten India. But I think that for India, the hope is that these strikes, and not just the initial strikes, but the broader clash that took place, will lead to a situation where India is not threatened as much by terrorism. But again, it's way too soon to know if it's been successful, and if we could how to measure that. It's notable that the Prime Minister Modi made a speech soon after the ceasefire in which he essentially laid out a new doctrine, which I think to me and other analysts came across as really an effort to essentially initiate this new sense of deterrence, in the sense that India would declare any attack in India as an act of war, that it's not going to be intimidated by nuclear blackmail, and it's not going to differentiate between terrorists and their sponsors. Clearly, the goal there is to deter any state from sponsoring terrorist actors that could threaten India. But again, it remains to be seen if that's going to be successful.
Conflict. It wasn't just India and Pakistan watching the skies, but everyone from Washington to Beijing were recalibrating, right? So what lessons do you think did India and Pakistan take away from from recent confrontations? Also, if you can add on to the takeaways that Washington and Beijing took from this clash as two great powers with higher stakes in the South, in this region.
I think that what really stands out, one of the main takeaways from this clash, is certainly the idea of so many key countries, key capitals being concerned about what was going on beyond India and Pakistan, but also looking at the weaponry that was used and the fact that you had both countries drawing on significant levels of military supplies that came from other countries. And it's clear that both India and Pakistan have been able to properly fill gaps in their own indigenous defense production systems. And India has been doing this for quite some time. And we know that India historically had depended on Russian military supplies, but in more recent years, it's increasingly been looking to the US, to France, to Israel, and some others for supplies. And, we know that even if India has neither confirmed nor denied, but I think to me, it's quite clear that at least several Indian fighter jets were shot down, and that includes one or two French-made ones. And they were shot down by Chinese-made Pakistani jets. That's very significant. But I think the fact that you also had Turkish-made drones being deployed by Pakistan in this crisis shows that Pakistan is, I think, making some progress in achieving some parity with India when it comes to this capacity to diversify your sources of your external sources of military supplies. Now, in terms of the second question, I think that bottom line is that anytime you have two countries that are nuclear states engaging in hostilities, it's going to get the world concerned. I mean, I think that's very clear. If neither Pakistan nor India had nuclear weapons, this recent clash would not have gotten the attention and attracted the concern, including the mediation efforts by the US that it did. I think that's very clear. And so and I think that international perceptions and narratives changed very quickly. Initially, after the terrorist attack in Kashmir that triggered this whole crisis, after that took place, the international community was rallying to India's support, expressing solidarity, condemning the terrorist attack, and so on. But then, once the military crisis began, once India launched its strikes, and then once you had this escalating crisis, this is when the world became very concerned about what was happening. And I think that attention was started to focus less on the terrorist attack that precipitated the crisis and more so on the intensification of hostilities, which made countries around the world very concerned about nuclear escalation risks. So there was concern. I think that I would argue that the international community became increasingly concerned the more the crisis escalated, and especially as it escalated so quickly.
You have partially answered my next question as well, but coming to the main agenda of this podcast, the role of Trump administration in averting the full-blown war in South Asia. What, in your opinion, pushed the Trump administration to step in and broker a ceasefire between India and Pakistan? And if the fear was escalation, as you mentioned, what exactly were the U.S. fears?
So, I mean, there's still a lot that we don't know about the nature of the U.S. Diplomatic intervention, what prompted it, and so on. But my best understanding, based on my own conversations and sort of trying to, just look at this as an analyst, the messaging from the U.S. government was inconsistent for sure, right? I mean, we know that the Vice President Vance had, initially said that, we're going to provide all assistance to India in this joint fight against terrorism. And then he said in an interview sometime later that the U.S. is not going to get involved in other countries' wars. But the U.S. State Department had a consistent message throughout this crisis, and that was calls for de-escalation. So even when you had Trump saying that, well, they'll figure it out eventually, whenever you had Vance saying, well, we're not going to get in other wars, the State Department was repeatedly saying that we're calling for de-escalation. We're not watching this from afar. And so the Secretary of State had engaged with his counterparts in Pakistan and India, I believe, 2 times before the ceasefire was announced. Before the ceasefire negotiations began. So that's an indication of just who was driving the U.S. response. It was the Secretary of State and the State Department more broadly. But indeed, I mean, initially, it's one thing to simply be, working the phones, calling for de-escalation, and another thing to be involved in a ceasefire effort. So several points here. My sense is that President Trump might have overstated the role that the U.S. played in this whole thing. I do not think that the U.S. mediated ceasefire talks between India and Pakistan. I do think, though, that the U.S. did play a pretty significant role in urging the two sides to start moving toward ceasefire talks. And the main reason for that is indeed escalation risks, and particularly nuclear escalation risks. My sense is that when you had those Indian strikes that included targeting the Norcon air base in Rawalpindi. I mean, given the location, the sensitive nature of that targeting, and also when the Pakistani government signaled publicly that it intended to convene a national command authority. I think that that's when the U.S. concern really became greater. And so that's when the U.S. government went into overdrive. It's unclear to me if President Trump himself actually got directly involved and made a call to any of his counterparts, but I do know that's Rubio and also Vance. Despite his earlier misgivings about getting involved, he was involved too. But the final point I'll say on this is that I would argue, and I and others have mentioned this in recent days, the U.S. might have been pushing at an open door. It's not like that the U.S. came into this and did a lot of work to get the two sides to agree to hash out a ceasefire. My sense is that even though, in those hours before the ceasefire was announced, the two countries, their tensions were incredibly high. Hostilities had escalated to incredible levels. But I do think that even at that point, each government, India's and Pakistan's, had reason to believe that they could essentially declare victory and step off and look for off ramps. So, in other words, they themselves were inclined to look for talks toward a ceasefire, and the U.S. was essentially urging them to do so. But I think that they were already willing to go that route themselves.
Right. Now, suppose that another crisis breaks out. And to be very frank, the risk of a crisis between India and Pakistan never disappears. What tools or leverage does Washington really have today to bring two sides again from brink of a full-blown war?
I mean, and I'm sure you know that the history of U.S. involvement when it comes to these situations is not to preemptively do much at all. I mean, definitely the U.S. has a strong interest in a workable India-Pakistan relationship, or at least one that's not in crisis, or much less one that's in conflict. Um, and I think that what the U.S. likes to do in ordinary circumstances is try to identify possible. Um, Possible off ramps or confidence building measures that could essentially enable India and Pakistan to have a more workable relationship, and perhaps propose put those out there just to make sure that each side sees those.
Mhm.
But other than that, it may seem like a contradictory policy. The U.S. has a strong interest in a workable India-Pakistan relationship, but it generally sort of stays back and doesn't try to do preemptively that much actively when they're not in crisis or not in conflict. But I think that's been the default U.S. position for quite some time. And as the U.S.-India relationship has strengthened in recent decades, I think that Washington, not just contemporary Washington, but previous U.S. governments as well, have recognized that India prefers that the U.S. not try to get involved and push the two to work things out, given that India's fear would mean that it would be forced to talk about the Kashmir issue, which it said is off the table, other than Pakistan-administered Kashmir. So, I think that the U.S. certainly recognizes. I think it got a wake-up call. The Trump administration in its early months had not intended to apply a strong strategic focus to South Asia. It was focused on trying to end the wars in Gaza and Ukraine. It was focused on matters closer to home. And so I think it got a wake-up call when you had this crisis that exploded so suddenly. So I think that it will continue to monitor what's going on. I think that the U.S. goal, the immediate goal, in the coming days and weeks, is to ensure it does what it can do to guarantee that the ceasefire stays in place. And that doesn't have to entail doing too much. It could entail, the Secretary of State perhaps periodically having a call with his counterparts in India and Pakistan and essentially urging them to ensure that things stay on track. But beyond that, I think that this administration, it's, as you know, it's very transactional, and I think it's not going to necessarily want to invest significant amounts of policy space on a particular issue that it feels has been calmed down for now. It's going to move back to other things, the trade front, and so on. So I think that what we can expect. I mean, the U.S. might have leverage. I would argue it does not have as much leverage as other countries like the Arab Gulf countries, which have very strong relationships with both India and Pakistan, and also have leverage because they provide significant amounts of support, whether you're talking about energy supplies or investment funds or what have you. But I think that for the U.S., the core goal will be to do what it can to ensure the ceasefire stays in place.
Right. Here is when things get interesting. President Trump did not talk about peace and war. He talked about trade, as you mentioned in the same breath. So, what does that tell us about the administration's approach towards South Asia?
Well, I mean, it's clear that trade is very much on the administration's mind, and certainly on the president's mind. I mean, he's made very clear that he wants to focus his foreign policy around new types of trade policies that benefit U.S. economic interests, and not let other countries take advantage of the U.S. in ways that could hurt its economy. Now, yes, I mean, he multiple times he said that trade was essentially used as a pressure tactic to get the two sides to agree to stop fighting. I don't know if I agree with that. I would not rule out the possibility that U.S. officials that had talked to counterparts in India and Pakistan had basically said, "Well, it'd be a lot easier to talk about trade if India and Pakistan are not fighting anymore." But I don't think it was really used as a hard pressure tactic. But look, I mean, it's true. India and Pakistan were two of the countries that were hit pretty hard by reciprocal tariffs, which of course are now being paused. And so, yeah, and I think that even rhetorically referring to the trade issue, President Trump might think that that could have some type of effect. But look, I mean, if you see where things are, India recently had a senior level delegation in Washington to carry out trade talks. India and the U.S. have pledged to pursue a new trade deal since Prime Minister Modi was in Washington in February. And it seems that those talks are on their way to reaching a first phase deal, which would show that despite this crisis in India and Pakistan, and despite the tensions that President Trump's messaging has injected into U.S.-India relations since the ceasefire was declared, doesn't appear to have impacted the trade talks. Again, if President Trump thought that by saying what he did publicly would be able to help move the needle forward, maybe that's an issue. But certainly, one could worry that India would be unhappy, or that India's unhappiness about the president's messaging on the crisis could impact how it would go about its negotiations with the U.S. on trade. But this seems to have not been the case, as we appear to be close to a deal. But the other interesting side of the story, of course, is that the U.S.-Pakistan relationship appears to have gotten some boosts in recent weeks, certainly because of the president's messaging in terms of calling for Kashmir to be looked at to push toward a resolution. And also, we've seen significant levels of interest, commercial interest, on the part of the U.S. in Pakistan because of critical mineral opportunities, crypto cooperation, that type of thing.
So now let's shift to something that makes headlines in India. That's hyphenation. Why did Trump administration return to the idea of treating Pakistan and India as a pair, when especially New Delhi wants to stand apart as a major power in its own right? So the frustration in this case was so deep. Some in the India criticized the Trump administration for announcing ceasefire before India did. So what do you think about that?
Yeah, so there's several things at play here. And first off, what I've been saying a lot in recent days is that we should not mistake these comments by Trump, many of which I assume are off the cuff comments. We should not mistake those for formal expressions of U.S. policy. That's the first point I would make. Second point I would make is that as you know, India tends to be very sensitive about any type of external mediation in its bilateral disputes with Pakistan. It certainly is receptive to that diplomatic intervention. I mean, the U.S. has, of course, intervened diplomatically in previous military crises and conflicts between India and Pakistan, but India does not want that intervention, that diplomatic intervention, to be broadcast to the world. It doesn't want it to be made public. And I think that's one of the main reasons why I was so upset when Trump went public so soon after the ceasefire was declared, and indeed before either the Indians or the Pakistanis could announce it, he did on social media. This has not happened in the past, so far as I know. I mean, a case of the U.S. mediating an India-Pakistan crisis, and then the U.S. president or a senior official to so quickly come out publicly and say, "Well, here's a ceasefire. We played this role in helping bring it about." So this is another reason why India is so concerned. But getting to the issue of hyphenation, I think that here, I mean, the U.S., and this is not new. I mean, the U.S. and other countries, as the crisis got more serious, looked at it through the lens of escalation risks and nuclear escalation risks. And at that point, you'd have to argue that there would inherently need to be some hyphenation, because the idea, when you're seeing this rapid intensification of hostilities, getting to the point where you sort of worry how much higher up the escalation ladder can they get before you run up against the nuclear ceiling, so to speak. The logical response to that is both sides. Push both sides to de-escalate. Talk about both sides, trying to agree to work together. And so, in that sense, in the middle of a crisis, I think it's invariable that there's going to be some hyphenation. But what's different this time around is how the president keeps fixating on the issue, and obviously bringing up the Kashmir matter makes things all the more concerning for India. But again, I'll repeat what I said earlier. We should not mistake this for what Trump is saying for U.S. policy. I mean, note that we've not seen any other U.S. official aside from Trump make these types of comments. And I would argue that the dehyphenation, which really started coming as a U.S. policy in the Clinton administration, it's continued exponentially, which allowed the U.S.-India relationship to really grow out. You've got a Trump administration that's full of very senior officials who are very very pro-India, in the sense that they want to see U.S.-India partnership succeed. So I think that, quite frankly, we'll see a reversion to the norm soon enough. It could take some time, but I think this administration will get back to how things were, in which essentially the priority is on strengthening relations with India. And when it comes to Pakistan, trying to pursue a friendly relationship, but one that will be more limited than the one with India. But I would argue that the more President Trump continues to make these statements and these messages, the more difficult it will be for India to simply shrug this all off as a case of Trump will be Trump, to the point that they start to worry that this may represent some type of new normal of U.S. policy, which I argue is not the case.
So before we wrap up the discussion here, there are some significant issues that I would want to highlight and get your opinion on. Michael, as someone closely looking at the region, what do you think the next crisis looks like between India and Pakistan? And what you already talked about the CBMs. So what is the efficacy of existing CBMs between the two countries? And if I may add one bigger question in that, can the relationship normalize between India and Pakistan in a foreseeable future? I'm sorry, I know there are so many aspects clubbed in one question, but given the time limitation, I wanted to cover these things with you.
Yeah, thanks. No, those are all good questions. I can respond with just a few quick points. One, I think the relationship is in a worse place now than it's been for many years, which is striking, given that for the last 4+ years before this most recent crisis, things were fairly good, or not good, but things were fairly calm, right? You had the LOC truce in early 2021, which significantly brought down violence along the LOC and led to a few years where things were relatively good. Not good, relatively calm, which makes the fact that they've been plunged into this what I would describe as a long-term low pretty significant. I think what's especially tricky this time around is that the space for diplomacy and dialogue has really been limited. I mean, the fact that there's a suspension of the Indus Waters Treaty, I think it's going to be very difficult to that's a pretty big blow. And the fact that trade has been completely halted, including trade through third countries. You mentioned CBMs, I mentioned CBMs. Trade was a CBM because so long as there was some of it, that was something that allowed there to be engagement and so on. That's going to be a big blow as well. Now, Rubio in his comment after the ceasefire said the two sides had agreed to talks on a broad set of issues in a neutral site. I find it hard to believe India would agree to that, quite frankly. And if you look at how the tone of Modi's speech when he was laying out that new doctrine, I think that leaves little space for any type of engagement. I think that what will be important to watch in terms of signposts to watch to ensure things don't get even worse, because I think that's what we have to talk about. Not how could things get better in the relationship, but to ensure things don't get worse. The dialogues that are still taking place, dialogues mandated by treaties, and that includes, of course, the meetings each year to exchange information about nuclear sites, as well as information about prisoners that each side has of the other's nationals in their possession. Those are important. I mean, it may seem very modest and insignificant, but that's pretty much all you have. So so long as those continue, I think that's a good thing. So long as the DGMO hotline continues to be used, that would be a good thing. And we know that was used during the recent crisis as well. But I think in terms of the next crisis, what could it look like? It's typically there's a trigger, and it's a very similar trigger, and that's an attack in India. India administered Kashmir, India, broadly speaking, that's what we've seen over the period of the last few decades. And even when relations are in a fairly calm point, that's typically what happens. Call it a spoiler effect, call it what you will, but that seems to be it. But I would also argue that the suspension of the Indus Waters Treaty looms so large here, and I do think that it might be an exaggeration to talk about the risk of a water war, but this is something that I think over the long term could really cause severe tensions between India and Pakistan. I mean, as you know, I don't need to tell you or your audience, Pakistan is a water insecure country, even in the best of times. But when you have critical source of water supply suddenly imperiled because of what India could do over the longer term to prevent it from coming into Pakistan, as climate change effects worsen, I think we're talking about a very significant risk of some type of conflict triggered by water sometime down the road. So that may not be the next crisis, but it could be one that erupts some years down the road. Final point I'll make, getting back to your question about normalization, I think that it really depends on leadership. You need to have the right set of leaders in both countries that have the vision and the courage to pursue something, to pursue a peace process. But I don't think at this point in time either side is in a position to be able to pursue that. Certainly, especially the Indian side, but I don't think the Pakistani side either. Hopefully, another time down the road, there'll be a different leadership dynamic that might allow for that to yield to some type of peace process.
With that, we are going to conclude today's discussion. Thank you so much, Michael. It was really a pleasure having you.
Thank you. Thanks for featuring me.
What happened between India and Pakistan during this crisis and what role the US played will echo in the future crisis. But whether that echo is a warning or a guide, well, that's up to us. Thanks for joining me on Chaos Knowledge. If you found this episode insightful, share it, like it, and send us your feedback. We will be back soon. Until then, stay informed.